Let us pray. O Lord, you called your priest, St. John Bosco, to be a father and a teacher of youth, and with the help of the Virgin Mary, to work with tireless zeal for the Church. Impelled by love like his, may we seek souls and serve you alone. Through Christ our Lord. I must say that I am profoundly edified by your spirit of recollection and the exemplary silence. And don't think I say this at every retreat I preach. Now, for instance, I was not profoundly edified last week, possibly because Father Vincent had not stressed silence and recollection the way it did at the beginning of this retreat, if you recall. But I will say that I was edified by other things last week. For instance, by the way in which the confreres participated at the Holy Hour and at the healing prayer service. I understand that both the director and coordinator have to be leaving us before the weekend of this retreat. They are on a retreat mission preaching too. And so accordingly, some changes have been introduced in the schedule. The Holy Hour, for one, will be held tonight instead of Thursday night. And the healing prayer service will be held tomorrow evening. I think I will tell you more about this healing service that so impressed me. I thought the Holy Hour was beautiful, impressive, even moving. So let's make it such tonight. Let's put our hearts into it, grateful for the incomparable gift of the Eucharist to us, and too sorry that all too often our response to it is half-hearted and ungenerous. Tomorrow we will keep the day in the remembrance of what we studiously and usually relegate from our thoughts, death. We keep closing our eyes to this unpleasant reality. Yet, for a Christian, and especially for a religious, death is a sobering and salutary lesson. More than anything in our life, death invites us to look upon all things in the light of eternity. And so we will offer the Requiem Mass for the deceased confreres at the Eucharistic Assembly. But we will also pray for all who in some way touched our life and are now at rest in Christ. During the day, let's often think about death, but serenely, not morbidly, as it behooves Christians who believe in the love of the risen Lord. I might suggest the reading of the prayers of the exercise for a happy death, personal reading, of course, or possibly of pertinent scriptural passages. We mentioned Don Caviglia this morning. He was in great demand as a retreat preacher. He was a fascinating speaker, but could be a bit lengthy. In fact, seldom did he give a conference that did not last at least 1 hour and a half or 1 hour and 45 minutes. One day, and that's much too much even for a fascinating speaker, we know it. One day, at a retreat in Lanzhou, near Turin, remember, the retreat preachers used to sit at a table, rather high dais, and one day a non-well-meaning confrere placed a fairly large alarm clock on that table. And he set it, believe it or not, the strange things that used to be done. There are stranger yet to be told, and I will tell you some of them. Believe it or not, he set the clock to ring after 45 minutes. Now, Don Caviglia did not appear to notice the clock when he got to the place. But when it did go off with a loud ringing, he clamped it shut and then said, "This was meant to wake up the sleepers. Now on to the second point of my conference." So my prayer is that I will not need a clock. Of the memorable retreat preached in our province by Venerable Bishop Celia, soon to be martyr saint, I vividly recall two things. His statement that every Salesian owes his vocation to a direct, if not always clearly discernible act of God's loving providence, and two, his statement that our religious vocation is basically un affaire du cœur. He used the French expression, even though he was talking in Italian to us. A love affair between us and the Lord. With regard to the first point, he asked us to consider carefully the circumstances that led us to Don Bosco. In one way or another, possibly in more ways than one, he said, you will find the hand of God in it. I know it was in my case, he added. And with utter simplicity and candor, he told us the story of how he became a Salesian. Here is what he told us. I was at the oratory and was chosen to greet Don Bosco at a program on his feast day, June 24th, 1887, the last one of his life. At the end of the address, I walked up to where Don Bosco was seated to kiss his hand, as was customary. He shook my hand and then held on to it. Luigi, he said, I never did tell you this before, but you and I will always be friends. Being somewhat excited, I hurriedly said, yes, Don Bosco, without really knowing what his words meant. I realized it a few days later when I, who had not up to that moment given much thought to becoming a priest, and even less a Salesian, was suddenly struck as if by lightning. A friend of Don Bosco, and forever. Why, this means that I must become a Salesian. And so it was that our society gained a great Salesian, and the church a bishop, a martyr, and a saint. Incidentally, in the library, there is a photograph of Bishop Versilia framed on the table with an autograph which he left here to the Porchester community when he visited. This was 2 years before he was killed in China. I was traveling with Father Aeneas Tozzi, our provincial, as many of you remember, during the last war. on the long journey by train from Tampa to New York in 1942. We were talking about Don Bosco. You knew him well, Father, I said. Do you have any particular recollection of him? If I do, he replied. And right from the very first contact I had with him, I was a student at the school, Salesian school in Faenza, near Bologna. And at the close of my last high school year, the director decided to take half a dozen of our students to Turin. I was an only son, and my father had died 3 years previously. My mother was not very keen about my trip to Turin. Don't let that priest Don Bosco grab you like he has several other boys around here, she told me. I don't want you to become a priest. Your father was a doctor, and that's good enough for me. I promised her, though frankly I had seriously considered becoming a Salesian. In Turin, our first visit was to Don Bosco. He was not well, but he gave us a very warm reception. I had placed myself at the tail end of the line of the 5 or 6 boys, each of whom was being presented to Don Bosco by our director. He had a good word for each one of us, Don Bosco. But when my turn came, he looked at me and said to the director, "This boy and I are not friends," and gave me a pat on the head. Everyone, even the director, thought Don Bosco was joking. Not I. Those words, that look, were not meant to be a joke, and I knew it. I was unhappy, even though I did not show it outwardly as we went to see the sights around Turin. So what did I do? In Our Lady's Basilica on the following day, I made my confession and communion, and I prayed, "Lord, I know my mother would not like it one bit, but if you can help me, I will be a Salesian." Before we left for home, we went back to see Don Bosco. Note that I had not said a word to anyone. I placed myself again at the tail end of the line, but this time Don Bosco singled me out immediately. "Come, Enea," he said. "Now we really are friends." On the train on the way home to Faenza, I told my story to the director, who took me to my mother as soon as we arrived home. "Signora Tozzi," he said to mother, "Enea has quite a story for you." I'll never forget my mother's words. "What you and Don Bosco did not cook up for me," she said, with tears in her eyes, and added, "Well, if that is what is meant to be, I am not certainly going to fight the Lord or Don Bosco." And now, please, a personal remembrance. I could not help but think of how mysterious are the ways of God when on July 29, 1956, I attended the funeral of my brother, Father Louis, who, as many of you remember, died in his last year as director of our Boston Technical School. With that somewhat flamboyant eloquence for which he was well known, Cardinal Cushing began his eulogy of Father Louis with these words: "The Don Bosco of Boston is dead." Poor Louis would have been dismayed at such dramatics. Anyway, I remembered in those moments how Louis, he was some 9 years older than I, had found his way to Don Bosco. Though he had been at a Salesian school near Turin as a high school student, the idea of becoming a Salesian had never crossed his mind. He attended a state college and aimed to enter medical school in Turin. My father was worried. He had a few vineyards, but in those days, Asti Spumante was not selling at the price it sells now, I can tell you. He had those few vineyards, a grocery store, but he also had 10 of us children. There was no way on earth he could find the money to St. Louis through medical school. Dad confided easily in his uncle, Father Philip Rinaldi, who the year before, 1922, had been elected rector major of the society and third successor of Don Bosco. Dad told him one day that Louis, who incidentally was quite a favorite with Father Philip, that Louis was about to take the entrance exams to get into medical school. Now we let Dad tell the story. I was about to tell Father Philip what my problem was, no money, when he suddenly interrupted me. Keep this for yourself, he told me. Louis will become a Salesian. Well, Dad did not quite keep it all to himself. He told Mother, and both wonder, Louis a Salesian? How can Father Philip say that? How does he know? On the day Louis was to take the entrance test, he went to see Father Philip. He said later, Father Philip was, as always, very kind, wished me well for the exam, gave me his blessing, and told me to stop and say a prayer in Our Lady's Basilica before I went for the test. I did. And right there, suddenly everything changed. No, not a doctor, but a priest and a Salesian. That's what I'll be. I did not go to the state school for my test and caught the train for Asti and Lou being our native town. Now I'll finish the story. I recall it was a fine September day. We had just begun our lunch, all 8 or 10 of us around the table, when who comes in but Louis, unexpectedly. But your entrance exam, Dad asked him. Well, Louis replied, I might just as well tell you right away. I have changed my mind. I am not going to medical school. I am going to become a Salesian. I remember Mother was dishing out the soup and nearly dropped the ladle. Tears and smiles all over her face as everyone joined in the feasting. A month later, Father Philip gave Louis the habit at a private ceremony in the little chapel near Don Bosco's rooms. At the end of October 1923, Louis sailed for America, New Rochelle, and the novitiate with incomparable Father Pinelli as novice master. You wonder why I bring up these episodes. They are meant as an invitation. This is what Monsignor Bishop Versilia told us, to examine during these days of the retreat how our own vocation came about. If I were to try to tell you how my vocation came about, you'd run me out of this place, I'm afraid. I don't think anybody knows, and I don't think I'll tell anybody. Well, anyway, each one of us has his own story. Well, we don't have to go searching for the dramatic in our vocation. In the persistent, persuasive voice we heard in our innermost being, in the difficulties we were able to overcome, in the agonies and the ecstasies our vocation put us through, we too must see the signs of a privileged lover of a God who from the day he formed us in our mother's womb has never ceased to say to us, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Now this eases us perfectly into the second part of the conversation, the subject also suggested by Venerable Bishop Versilius' unusual but most effective words, that our religious vocation is essentially an affaire de coeur, a love affair. It is not the best rendering, I would say, love affair, not the best rendering of affaire de coeur, but pretty much close to it. God is love. Our very existence is an act of God's love. Jesus is the perfect, the ultimate manifestation of that love. It is what St. John says, literally. God's love was revealed in our midst in this way. He sent his only Son to the world. Ecstatic and lyrical St. Bernard writes, it is love that was born in Bethlehem, love that walked the roads of Galilee and Judea, love that was crucified on Calvary. This is very poetic, but true. The Church of Christ, the Church Christ established, is a koinonia, a community of love. In this will all men know you to be my disciples, if you love one another as I have loved you. Love is truly the constituting element of our life as Christians. It is even more so of our life as religious. Father Louis Pichetta, our society's first great theologian, the one with the runaway cope, remember, states in his masterful treatise on the religious life, while the vows qualify me juridically as a religious, they do not make me such, theologically speaking, before God, that is. Only my love for him, total and exclusive, a love which drives me to be chaste for his sake, poor for his sake, obedient for his sake. Only this love makes a religious out of me in name and in fact. It is quite possible, and not just theoretically so, Don Pichetta continues, for me to be chaste, poor, and obedient without love. Were it so, I would not be religious. In fact, I would not even be a Christian. Don Bosco used to refer to Don Pichetta as a celebrity. And Don Pichetta's textbooks of moral theology, generations of priests and bishops nourished their minds both in Europe and in America, even here. Don Pichetta wrote and spoke in flawless Latin, wrote poems in Latin Virgil might admire. Pope Leo XIII, himself a great Latinist, used to exchange poems with Don Pichetta. When Leo saw him for the first time at the Vatican, remember he was very small, he embraced little Don Pichetta, saying in Latin, of course, Tantilus et tantus, so small and so great. He held for several years the chair of divinity at the University of Turin, when a chair of divinity was connected with the State University, no more now. And like Don Amossi, who taught theology at the oratory, Don Pichetta would leave that lofty chair as divinity teacher to go to the festive oratory at Valdocco and teach the youngsters catechism. Now what follows, Father Bocatello tells me, should not be applied to Don Piscetta, but to Donna Mossi. However, the story came to me from Donna Medei, and I think is a very reliable source. Like Donna Mossi, Don Piscetta had to have his snuff. But unlike Donna Mossi, he was as neat as a pin. He would be seen taking snuff only with intimates. I remember he always kept 2 handkerchiefs. One he used only when he snuffed, and I let you know the state of the handkerchief. I don't have to let you know. The other spotlessly white for normal use. His catechism lessons to the boys at the festive oratory were famous. He wanted the youngest boys for himself because he used to say, I am small and I fit in very well with them. He held them spellbound with stories and rather original illustrations. One day he was describing to them the soul in the state of grace. See this handkerchief, he told them, unfolding before them his white, clean handkerchief. It is the state of your soul, the way your soul looks without sins. But when you are bad, disobedient, mean, your soul is like this. And out came the snuff-laden handkerchief, which is spread before the wondering eyes of those youngsters. One lesson I think they never forgot, for sure. But that's the way even a great man made his point with the little ones, becoming small with the small. What Don Piscetta wrote about the religious vows 60 and more years ago has the freshness of what we read in the decree Perfectae Caritatis of the Second Vatican Council. Let's read what it says. Not right. What Don Piscetta says is almost a carbon copy of what later the decree Perfectae Caritatis stated. What makes my vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience precious in the sight of God is the intensity of love that inspires me to make and practice these vows so I can be completely at God's disposal, ready to give myself unreservedly to his service and to the service of my brothers, exactly as Jesus did, who chose to be poor, chaste, obedient, in order better to fulfill his vocation of service to the Father and to his brothers. In other words, the religious, convinced that the call of Jesus to follow him is the supreme proof of God's love for him, makes his reply one of total love to him. And here is where Venerable Bishop Versilia is absolutely right when he says that our religious vocation is fundamentally a love affair between God and me. The Scripture goes even further and calls it a marriage between God and the soul. Isaiah 62:5 reads, as a young man marries a virgin, your Creator will marry you. And as a bridegroom rejoices in his bride, so shall your God rejoice in you. Our own constitutions in Article 73, speaking of our profession, equate it to a sort of mystical wedding between God and the soul of the religious who vows himself. It is a visible meeting of the love of Christ who calls with the love of the disciple who answers. It makes one of the noblest choices open to a believer. If this exchange of love between God and the religious can be equated to the love of a man for his bride, we should not hold back from saying that on the spiritual level, God's love for me and my love for him fulfills our sexuality. Now I am introducing something here with which I don't have to have you agree, but it is something so true. It almost comes logically from our quotation of the scripture and even of our Constitution. Sexuality, we know, is at the root of all I-you relationships. Because of my sexuality, I can enter into an intimate rapport which need not include the genital aspect of sexuality at all, with a person, a very specific you. By giving that individual, me, the gift of my person, that is, assuming, of course, that he is willing to accept it. Now you must think I lifted these words from the latest book on psychology. Would you believe it? They are from notes I made over 50 years ago when at Fordham University College I was taking a course in educational psychology. We had a marvelous teacher, an Austrian-born Jesuit, Father Feige, whose German accent, I remember, could be cut with a knife. In line with his definition of sexuality, just quoted, Father Feige told us things that came to me as a total revelation. He said, the I in me, not this I, but the I in me, can give up a lot of things, but can never do without a you, a particular person, that is, with whom to relate in a very special, intimate, unique way. Sexuality is part and parcel of our personality. We must take it seriously. If the I in me cannot have a deep rapport with a you, I risk becoming stunted, psychically an amputee, unfulfilled, and neurotic. Father Feige, the Jesuit. Dr. Feige, I remember, besides being a brilliant teacher, was a very amiable man. Intransigent he was on one thing, no questions during the lectures. 4 questions he reserved unfailingly the last 25 minutes of the lesson. We were prepared, and I'm sure he was, to hear all kinds of questions, but the one a student asked him after the lecture on sexuality one day, we were not prepared for. I am serious, Dr. Feige, the student said, and I hope you don't mind my asking a question. You have just told us that every one of us, every single I, must relate to a specific you. I happen to have one such you. She is very nice, and I hope she will be my wife someday. But in your case, as a priest, how do you relate, or who do you relate to? Who is the you of your I? With imperturbable calm, Dr. Feige replied, this discourse would take us much too far right now. And I am not sure, he said to the young man, that you are prepared to understand all its implications. Let me just say that I made my choice long ago, and I am grateful I did. But if you really want to know who my you is, my problem is simple. My answer to your question and problem is very simple. My you is God. Does that answer my question? I still remember the look on that young fellow's face. And now to the question that has been lurking possibly in your mind. Is it not true that only a human you can satisfy fully and fulfill a human me? Where else is a man or a woman to find happiness and fulfillment? The truth is that man's heart is a bottomless well that nothing on earth can ever fill. This is an everyday existential experience, and no one in his senses can possibly deny it. I think it was Persian poet Omar Khayyam who wrote, listen, when I thought that the truth I discovered had filled my mind with light, I heard it say to me, I am only a speck of truth. When I thought that the love I shared with my friend was causing my heart to burst, I heard it say to me, I am only a speck of love. When I thought that the happiness I found had touched every part of me, I heard it say to me, I am only a speck of happiness. St. Augustine used fewer words, but said it much better. Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they will find rest in you. It is altogether possible that in moments of loneliness and frustration, there is not one here, not one of us, who has not gone through them. We may have thought that we gave up too much when we became religious. In one of Bernanos, the famous French writer, fiction writer, in one of Bernanos' finest novellas, there is a significant dialogue between the protagonist, a youngish monk, and a woman. How could you give up so much? She asked him. Did I really give up that much? He replied. A monk, a priest, becomes all things to all men. But how can you love many without giving your heart to one? She persisted. And the monk, I did give my heart to one. And he pointed to the crucifix on his desk. The day before we professed, at the end of our novitiate, I think Father John Romano should remember this at least. I think so. Simple, that was the day before we made our profession. Simple, practical Father Binelli, our novice master, placed the crucifix on the blackboard in the study room. The words he wrote on the board were from the antiphon sung in those days at the profession ritual. Quem vidi, quem amavi, in quem credidi, quem dilexi. It is the Lord I sought and loved. It is the Lord I trusted and chose. We might just stop a few moments before the tabernacle today to tell him that we have not changed our mind, but not without a bit of soul searching first. Have I lost sight of the fact that when I left all things to follow Jesus in the religious life, the Lord became my life's central and only concern? Do I realize that He is or should be the sole goal to which I must direct my heart, my mind, my energies? What has happened to my resolve to love Him always, to love Him exclusively, to love Him above all and any creature? Have I replaced Him in my heart with concerns, affections, creature comforts, pleasure-seeking that only create in me disillusion, frustrations, and discontent with my life? Is it not just possible that I live with one foot in the world and one in the religious life, hobbling pathetically along in the footsteps of Christ? Whatever the answer to these questions, let each of us say to him, it is you, beloved Master, I want to seek and choose and love and trust. Oh, Father, have mercy upon our deceased confreres who have gone before us in faith. May the Eucharist we offered for them this morning be for us the way to salvation, and for them the means of forgiveness. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. I think it is again Cicero who says that as we get old, we tend to mellow and become soft-hearted. Anyway, I was frankly touched by last night's holy hour. The personal petitions addressed to the Lord were worth 1,000 sermons. The singing was so lifted. We want more of it, Brother Vincent, please. And speaking of anything worth 1,000 sermons, I think the good night of Father Zuliani was. Unquestionably, there were beautiful, precious nuggets of wisdom which we will treasure for years to come. And inspiring too our Eucharistic assemblies in their dignified simplicity. I think that magnificent is the Reformed liturgy if we stay within the limits, its limits, and not go on liturgical sprees as often happens. I was nourished and literally raised on the old liturgy. I have few, if any, nostalgic feelings for it. The treasures which the new liturgy unlocked for us are for all to see. People now, and believe me, for almost 15 years, I had this experience. The moving from the old liturgy to the new one in a beautiful parish. And I came to the conclusion that people now understand, love, and share the Mass as they never did before. Truly, to my mind, it was the greatest achievement of Vatican II. Now please do not forget that open forum Friday night. Make a mental, or even better, written note of some of the things you hear and you like better explained, or you might even like to contest them. Take this morning's conference. We are touching on controversial points, and you might very well not agree with them. So let's put them on the table at an open discussion, which can be very enlightening. As the Dies Domini, the day of the Lord's final call for me, draws closer and closer, and let's face it, there is no use closing one's eyes to reality, I feel more than ever grateful for the privilege and the blessing of having known exceptional Salesians, many of whom influenced my life for good in more ways than one. One such man was Father Alfonso Volonté, last of the Salesians in the United States to have known and dealt with Don Bosco. As you may know, he was my predecessor at Corpus Christi Church in Portchester, and he lived at the rectory for several more years after he resigned as pastor. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1956 at age 84. I grew up with saints, he used to tell me sometime. and look at me. He had actually lived with 6 of them: Don Bosco, Don Rua, Venerable Bishop Versilia, Blessed Luigi Orione, Venerable Beltrami, and Prince Czartoryski. For 1 full year, he told me, I had Blessed Orione and Venerable Bishop Versilia on either side of me as students in the refectory at the oratory. Later, as a student of philosophy in Valsalice, I often took the meals to Don Beltrami and to Prince Czartoryski, both of whom were confined by illness in their rooms. And I saw with joy the latest issue of our bulletin, finally, these 2 marvelous Salesian main figures, Beltrami and Czartoryski, beautifully portrayed. It's unbelievable, forgive me, how ignorant we can be of some of these magnificent men. Now I'll say something I don't know. I think, I mentioned this, that formation is important from the doctrinal standpoint, intellectual. But our young people need to look at examples, to look at men. I would place in the hands of novices the finest possible literature we have or can have on men like Czartoryski